On the last episode of the Keepsake box, I decided to pay Peaches a visit, but not for the reason that Antonio suggested. I decided to pop up and issue a stern warning. If she was at home, I would tough talk her. Knowing that she was wrong, her fear of Antonio would keep her from challenging me. If she wasn't home, I'd wreck her house and leave her a strongly worded note. I know that sounds crazy, but it's a trick of the goons. For some reason, people return to a house in disarray and draw a correlation between what happened to their house and what could happen to their bodies. I guess it makes sense. I arrived at Peaches' apartment complex and I noticed that her car was still in her parking spot. In spite of my perceived rashness, I wasn't really confrontational. I was disappointed to have had to go the stern warning route. I walked to the door and knocked. Great, I thought. Either Peaches didn't want to face me or she had really skipped town. I looked under the welcome mat. As usual, her spare key was still there. Peaches was predictable in that way. I went back to the car to put on gloves and to write the note. After folding it neatly, I wrote Peaches' name on the exterior and I walked back to the door. I knocked again, giving Peaches an opportunity to open the door on her own accord. To no avail, of course. I retrieved the key from under the mat. The moment I walked in, I knew that someone had already beaten me to the punch. Peaches' apartment was completely trashed. It looked like the work of Antonio's goons. One way to know for sure was to check for notes. The usual places were refrigerators, televisions, and bedroom mirrors, anywhere where the victim would likely look upon their return. I walked through the mess and made my way to the kitchen. There were dirty dishes in the sink, and that really stood out. Peaches was a meticulous cleaner. I blamed the goons for most of the mess, but it wasn't like Peaches to leave dishes in the sink. She usually washed them immediately after each meal. She hated dirty dishes. I left the kitchen and headed to the bathroom. Again, the space was destroyed, but there was no note. The only place left to search was Peaches' bedroom. I already knew I'd find more destruction, but I was also hoping to find a definitive answer to whether it was our goons or one of the connects. Considering the fact that Antonio had sent me there, I was placing my bet on him. I slowly opened the door to Peaches' bedroom. Unlike the rest of the house, the bedroom was pristine, just as she would have kept it. There was no sign that anyone had been there, not even Peaches. I searched her drawers and mirrors and found no note. Maybe it wasn't the work of the goons. I hadn't ever known them to destroy a house without leaving a note. I thought for a moment. Peaches' bathroom was the only room left. I went into the bathroom to read the note that I knew I would find. I did find a note. I also found Peaches and Sticks in the bathtub, naked, with bags over their faces. They were parallel to each other, face to face. Peaches' left arm was resting on her hip. Prominently displayed was the left heart, one half of the friendship bracelet that she had purchased for us. I can't explain why, but I removed my glove and unlatched Peaches' bracelet. Her arm was still warm, really warm. Unable to control my bodily functions, I vomited into the toilet. I stared at their bodies. I knew the images would be burned into my mind forever, but I needed to see them. I needed to see Peaches while she was still warm. I needed to see her for the last time. I lifted the bag to display her face. Peaches' mouth was agape. Her pupils had rolled. I could only see the white parts of her eyes, which had broken blood vessels running throughout them. So many thoughts flashed through my mind. Seeing her naked body made me think of her in her prime. I remember the tales of Peaches once being the it girl that all the men wanted. I remember watching her dance and being envious of her perfect body. She was so fun. She was once so full of life, and she was gone. My eyes saw it all, but my heart and my mind couldn't process it. Life wouldn't ever be the same. I retrieved the note that was taped to the mirror. I put it in my back pocket, along with the note that I had intended to leave for Peaches. I ran to my car, hoping that I hadn't been seen. Remembering nothing of the ride, I drove to my hotel in complete silence. Once inside, I locked the hotel room door and pushed the couch in front of it. as if that would stop someone who had an intention to harm me. I collapsed into the bed and sobbed loudly. Peaches was gone. She was really gone. I retrieved both notes from my pocket. My hands were shaking, so much so that I could barely open the envelope. I finally got it open, fully expecting a harshly worded threat to anyone who had assisted Peaches. Instead, I found that it was meant for me. The note said, "Remember not to get so far ahead of yourself that you get left behind. I caught a falling star and put it in my pocket, hopefully saving it for a rainy day. Love always, your Anemone. P.S. I really wish I had gotten you a poodle instead of a feral dog." Things became even more real in that moment. Without a shadow of a doubt, I knew that Antonio had sent the goons to Peaches. Not only that, but I knew that he had ordered the hit and had it executed in the 30 minutes that it took for me to drive from the prison. 3 very distinct thoughts crossed my mind. 1, the goons still belonged to Antonio, very much so. 2, Antonio could touch me at any time, and he wouldn't hesitate to do so. 3, I had to get some rest, as I had to visit Antonio bright and early the next morning. Chapter 21. The Saga Continues. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. Antonio did his part and fixed the situation with the connects, just as he said he would. I was required to pay back the money that Peaches owed, but no one else had to die. I continued to handle the businesses, and all talks of Peaches and Sticks went away. It was as if they never existed. Angel and I carried on. It was business as usual in every way. Angel was the only person to somewhat mention Peaches, and I could tell that he was coming from a genuine place. Angel insisted that I pay him a visit the day after Peaches was killed. I visited Antonio, then went over to see Angel. He asked 3 questions. 1, are you okay? 2, do you need anything? 3, do you need to talk to someone? It's true what they say, news travels fast. Peaches hadn't been gone for a full 24-hour period, and Angel already knew the details. His questions that cued me into that fact. 1, Angel asked if I was okay because he knew that Peaches was gone. He was aware of how close we were. 2, he asked if I needed anything because he knew that I took a loss on the money that Peaches stole. Even so, I still had to pay back the money she owed. Boy, Peaches' point A really got me. 3, he asked if I needed to talk to someone because he knew I had found Peaches' body. He told me he could put me in contact with some good people, and I declined. Present day, I'm aware that I should have taken him up on his offer. There was such a stigma around mental health, but I needed counseling more than anyone I knew. Angel and I talked openly about my future. I informed him of Antonio's request, to which he only stated, "I'll see him." He never asked my position on the matter. He simply said, "I'll see him." I continued to visit Antonio, and I kept him abreast with all pertinent information. I tried to pretend that everything was the same, but it wasn't. How could it be? There were so many elephants in the room, and we didn't talk about things. We pretended to be unaffected, but we weren't. I wasn't okay, and I don't think Antonio was either. He loved Peaches too. I can't imagine that he felt okay about what he had done. Yet, life just continued to move. Antonio was set to come home 3 months after Operation Peaches. Per our agreement, I went to the prison to get him on the day that he was released. I addressed the receptionist and sat down to await Antonio's exit. 20 minutes into the wait, the receptionist called me up to the desk. She told me that Antonio had already been released. What? Released? I had talked to Antonio 2 days prior, and it was always the plan for me to pick him up. I felt confused and dejected. There was a lot to the story of Antonio and Shelonda, but for some reason, His decision to leave with someone else was the ultimate betrayal. I think it was the rejection. The fact that Antonio had rejected me was jarring. It would have been fine if I didn't want him, but him not wanting me created an issue. Had my anemone found another clownfish? In my heart, I knew that had to be so. I hated the feeling of rejection, and that always caused me to want the other person more. I can't explain it. I thought back to how bothered I was when Brandon broke up with me for Toya Boone. I remembered how hurt I was when Ron started giving Mom attention instead of me. I thought back to how angry I was when I found out about Ken and Melanie. On each of those occasions, I wanted the person even more after I had been hurt. I wish I'd had a better understanding of myself. I wish I realized that I was enough without having to be wanted by someone who didn't really have the best of intentions. That would have made life so much easier. Maybe that would have changed everything. I wish. I made the drive, wondering where I stood with Antonio. After running a few errands, I finally made my way home. Living up to his ability to surprise me, Antonio was already there. He was quietly sitting on my couch awaiting my arrival, just as he had been on the night that I found out he was going to prison. Antonio had parked in the rear to conceal his presence. "Well," I said, "look what the cat drug in." Antonio stood and extended his arms to hug me. I watched him, shocked and amazed that he had shown up like it was just a regular day. I bypassed him and sat on the opposite end of the couch. "So, I see you found a ride." "Come here," said Antonio. I laughed. I told him if he wanted to be near me, he should have waited for me to pick him up. A little more stern, Antonio told me to come to him. I pivoted my body towards him, still sitting on the couch. I stared, waiting to see if he would come to me. I wanted to know if he thought I was worth it. Antonio walked over to where I was seated on the couch. He sat beside me and interlocked his fingers with mine. Antonio looked directly into my eyes as he spoke. He said, "You know I love you, right? You just have to learn that I'm not on your time." I didn't speak. He told me that I wasn't cut out for that life, and he was sorry to have brought me into it. Antonio apologized for the Peaches situation, as if he had simply stepped on her foot. He admitted that things had gone too far, and he wanted to know if we could start over. "Start over?" I asked. "How do we just start over, after everything we've been through?" "Just bow out, little girl." That was his answer. Just bow out. As if we could fix everything. Just bow out. As if that would absolve me of my guilt related to Peaches' death and Sharon losing her salon. Apparently, the simple act of bowing out would change the past and allow us all to start over. For the first time, Antonio's solution didn't impress me. Antonio told me that he wanted me to allow him to be the man. He asked me to let him run the businesses and he would take care of me. "We can make this easy. We can just start over." I thought for a moment. As much as I wanted to keep up the facade, I knew he was right. I was tired. But more than being tired, I was scared. Truthfully, I knew I could resist. Legally, Antonio didn't have a leg to stand on. We hadn't made provisions for him to retrieve his businesses upon his return. But the goons, they ain't play by legal rules. By their standards, I knew that any day could be the day that I regretted being resistance. And I didn't want to end up in the bathtub. Antonio cupped my chin in his hands. He said, "What are we going to do? Are we going to make this easy?" I told him that I'd give him everything he asked for. Antonio looked into my eyes and addressed me. He said, "That's a good girl. And this Diablo thing, that's over, right?" I nodded my head, acknowledging that I would end my relationship with Angel. Antonio kissed me, and even though he had swindled me out of my business, I gave in. Even though I know he'd had Peaches killed, I gave in. And even though I knew I was within 30 minutes of being next, I gave in. I arranged a meeting between Angel and Antonio, and true to his word, Antonio did not allow me to attend. When it was all said and done, Angel and Antonio exited the office together and joined me in the lobby. Angel shook my hand and addressed me. "It was wonderful working with you, Star." He turned to Antonio. "I look forward to working with you." He walked out without saying another word. I guess the cold day in purgatory had arrived. And just like that, Angel and I were over. Just like that, the story of Shelonda and Antonio continued. And just like that, Star fell out of the sky. In letting go of Star, I thought about my connection to Peaches. She was my partner. She was a large part of Star being able to rise. I thought about her all the time, but I didn't openly grieve her. I couldn't. She just went away, taking with her our memories and our special bond. Peaches had crossed me and caused a lot of trouble for a lot of people. Even with the loss of $27,000, I would have let it slide 1,000 times over to erase the mental image of her and Sticks in that bathtub. I thought about it every time I closed my eyes. Even worse, I knew I played a part in it, and I found it extraordinarily difficult to forgive myself. But even harder was forgiving Antonio. I thought back to the creature with the head of a lion and the body of a shrimp. Peaches had succumbed to the nature of the beast. The shrimp in her ate with indifference, and the lion in her overindulged. And in the end, she popped. Peaches just popped. And with all the hurt in my heart and all the anger in my spirit, I had to continue as if Antonio and I were just starting over. We just kept moving. In thinking about it, I now realize something profound. For as hurt as I was over losing Peaches, my desire to rectify her death was overshadowed by my desire to be with someone. I didn't want to be lonely. I stayed with Antonio because I didn't want to be lonely. Antonio didn't rush to change the legalities of the situation. He knew I'd cooperate. I certainly had no desire to fight him. It was a month into his release before we returned to the lawyer's office to sign the papers, at my insistence. By that point, I just needed it to be over. I needed to be free. Antonio and I went to his lawyer's office. I found myself looking up at the sign, just as I had when Antonio had signed his businesses over to me. The law office of David L. Herkowitz, Esquire. Things had certainly changed since we last visited. 3 years prior, I was a scared young girl with a large undertaking ahead of me. But on that day, I was a boss. I was saddened by some of the events that had taken place, but proud of what I had been able to accomplish. I felt that I could let it go, knowing that I hadn't lost a thing. Well, other than Peaches. I gave Antonio all of his businesses back, in addition to Star's Bar. I ain't even want it anymore. He promised to keep the name the same, as a sign of the respect that he had for me and my hard work. But by that point, I didn't care much about his respect either. I only asked Antonio not to become involved with the Point C girls that I handed over to him. I didn't want them to feel that they had anything over me. Yep, that's where my mind was. Antonio gladly accepted everything back. He did, however, keep me as the beneficiary of his life insurance. Of course, we made a joke of it. He told me that he didn't trust me to run his businesses, but due to the fact that I love to give orders, he trusted me with his funeral arrangements. We both laughed. Even in the tensest of situations, Antonio and I could usually find an avenue for humor. I loved that. Maybe we could just start over. I reclaimed my spot on top of the hierarchy. Only there was no hierarchy. Peaches was dead, and since the strip club was no longer, Cream had basically evaporated. I hadn't heard anything from Sharon, and I had no desire to face her. Her salon was her passion, and I knew that. It was hard for me to think about seeing her, knowing that I had inadvertently contributed to its demise. I had crossed Sharon by dealing with Antonio, but I still loved and respected her. She was the first person to respect me and demand that I respect myself. I carried that guilt every day until it was replaced by a new guilt. a guilt that would surpass every other guilt in my life. I was surprised by how easily I fell back into my role. I thought that I would feel more slighted about falling back. Antonio did exactly what he said he would do. He took over Star's bar and kept the name the same. He kept the system of accounts and sub-accounts, and I kept the books. And even though he knew that I had my own money, Antonio continued to provide for me. I allowed him to present the image of being the man. We both pretended that things were the same as they were before he went away. But so much had changed otherwise. Things felt different without the strip club. I missed the girls, and I missed Cream and Peaches. Although our basic situation was the same, things felt completely different between me and Antonio. We joked around a lot, that's who we were. But Antonio no longer smiled at me the same way. He didn't look lovingly into my eyes anymore. He called me little girl in passing, but it wasn't the same. It didn't have the cute affection attached to it. Everything felt so strange. Antonio and I no longer had great sex. When we did have sex, it wasn't our usual passionate sex. It was means to an end sex. It was quick and to the point, which was unfortunate. Sex with Antonio was amazing before, but that definitely wasn't related to his girth. Antonio was a caring and sensual lover. He was skilled in the art of touch. He was quite good in the oral department as well. But being perfectly honest, Antonio was small down there. He was quite small. The penis size wasn't an issue when he compensated otherwise, but cutting the sensual part out of the equation was problematic, to say the least. I started to understand why Cream had stopped caring about having sex with Antonio. If that's what she was getting, I could see why she hadn't cared to have it at all. It was the type of sex that could only be enjoyed with feelings involved. Otherwise, it was pretty awful. I began to think of myself as the new Cream. I started to care a little less, and Antonio was starting to feel like a source of income, and less of a boyfriend. I suspected that there was someone else, someone newer and younger. That was Antonio's pattern of behavior. I wondered if it was one of the Point C girls, and that thought infuriated me. Yet, the Antonio and Shelonda show remained for another year, with the regret, anger, sadness, ill feelings, awful sex, and suspicion. The saga continued. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.